Now, for a while, there have been rumors floating about and hopes from some fans that the Star Wars Sequel Trilogy will either be retconned, which basically means removing it from the official canon, or just sort of overwritten by new content that's coming, with maybe The Mandalorian and some of these spin off shows being a sort of catalyst for an eventual change. And though that might sound kind of extreme or very unlikely to just erase those three movies or to try again, and I'll talk more about the likelihood in a bit, it can't be denied that in the year now since The Rise of Skywalker came out, that the sequels and or the time period they're set in have basically been ignored. There's been no new shows, books, or comics announced that will be set in or directly around them, no new toys or collectibles or other forms of merchandise really released or planned for them, and you'd really think if they thought those movies had been popular, that they'd be doing all they could to take advantage of the post-sequel excitement. That they'd be cranking out as much content and merchandise as they could, the same way they're doing that now for The Mandalorian, which, as mentioned a moment ago, is getting a couple spin-off shows. Anyway, this ignoring of the sequels has sort of further fueled speculation, or again hope from some fans, that maybe Disney and Lucasfilm would be willing to just sort of forget those movies existed and to try again. Not saying they'd make a whole new trilogy and also call them the sequels, but they'd be willing to tell a new and different story somewhere, somehow. However, here there is one upcoming project, the Rogue Squadron movie, that many say kind of contradicts or destroys this possibility that Lucasfilm will do away with the sequels. They point at what Kathleen Kennedy said during the presentation or at the announcement, that she said, "The story will introduce a new generation of starfighter pilots as they earn their wings and risk their lives in a boundary-pushing, high-speed thrill ride and move the saga into the future era of the galaxy." Which, yes, at face value does very much sound like we're going post The Rise of Skywalker with this movie, and who knows how far past it may be. But that's not exactly what she says, is it? She's actually rather vague and was actually very vague throughout the whole presentation. And though I'm not trying to twist her words and play a game of semantics here, there's of course a really good chance the sequels will forever remain part of the canon and that they hope they can do some patchwork around them to make them better. Still, she could have literally said something like, "This will be the first story set after the events of the Star Wars Sequel Trilogy," but she didn't. She just said, "future era of the galaxy." And so keeping in mind this movie is 3 years away yet, the future era of the galaxy may not exactly be post The Rise of Skywalker anymore. There's a lot of time to start to undo things and tell a new story elsewhere, or to imply those events in those movies never actually happened, because a couple more seasons of The Mandalorian will have come and gone, as will perhaps a season or two of Ahsoka and Rangers of the New Republic, and maybe even this culmination series that will unite these three stories together into one larger story. And for all we know, this larger story could be about saving the galaxy from the return of Palpatine, or stopping him from ever coming back, and hence the events of the sequels never take place, or now take place in a sort of alternate timeline, thus they're not exactly flat out retconned, though I'm not sure how much of a consolation that'd be to the fans of the sequels, but stories could still be told in that timeline anyway. And really here, and I'm wondering if they realize it yet, but one of the biggest problems with the post-sequel trilogy era is that it actually has to be a lot like the post-original trilogy era when you think about it. On a larger scale, a lot of the exact same things would be happening, which ties directly into what I feel was one of the greatest flaws of the sequels, that they're basically telling the same story all over again, and it almost ends exactly as the original trilogy did, which means both post-era stories will or would be about the Republic needing to pick up the pieces and reassemble, as well as one lone Jedi remaining to start the Jedi Order back up. And so in many ways, all the post-sequel trilogy era would be is the same thing we're getting in the post-original trilogy era in shows like The Mandalorian right now, and no doubt with a show called Rangers of the New Republic, which is likely going to delve into, obviously, the rebuilding of the Republic to some degree. Which leads to the question, are they really going to have a show that does that, that shows the Republic coming into its own after the era of the Empire, only to have it all be for naught thanks to what happens in the sequels? And then they'll tell another story or set of stories after the Rise of Skywalker about the Republic being reformed again, to say nothing about Rey now starting a Jedi Order like Luke did before. I mean, this all sounds very redundant, not to mention very confusing, especially to the more casual fan who's going to be left wondering with each story they watch, is this set post Return of the Jedi or post The Rise of Skywalker? Which time period are we currently in? The one where they rebuild the Republic and Jedi Order but fail, or the one that maybe doesn't fail? And it's not like you can use visual cues in Star Wars to really help you out or set the time period, at least not that will be recognizable to the more casual fan. Because it's one thing when you set a movie in, say, the MCU a bit in the past, a movie like Captain Marvel, for example, where you can fill the movie with all sorts of little visual cues that let you know we're in the 90s, that it's out of the rather linear timeline that the MCU movies usually fall into. Heck, in movies in the real world, you can even do the obligatory show the date on a newspaper scene that so many shows and movies use to tell you exactly when and where a story is taking place. But if you saw something in Star Wars that said this is happening 25 ABY, or even flat out said 25 years after the Battle of Yavin, most will have no clue what that means. And so again, visual cues in Star Wars are oftentimes completely missed. I've literally had people I know ask me, when does Rogue One take place? Or were confused and wondered why it wasn't about Rey and Luke. And I honestly don't know if visual cues in Star Wars can get any more obvious than they do in that film, with things like Tarkin, the first Death Star, the base on Yavin, and everything else. And yet a lot of people still don't get it. They still get confused. And speaking of Rogue One, yet another thing that's going to confuse some people with Rogue Squadron, and I've already been asked this very question by a friend, is if it's a sequel to Rogue One or not. And I had to tell them that, yeah, it sort of is-ish, because Rogue Squadron is named after Rogue One, the call sign that we see made up on the fly in the movie of the same name, but I don't think it's going to have any more to do with it than that. The squadron in this future era is just going to be named after them for reasons, or will be named after the original Rogue Squadron, which does exist. We know we see it in The Empire Strikes Back. So anyway here, since we're talking about confusing the fans, and again especially the more casual fan who doesn't keep up with everything, which is fine if that's the type of fan someone is, I don't mean it disparagingly or anything like that. Anyway, one of the biggest arguments I see against the idea of retconning the sequel trilogy is that you're going to confuse people, that they're not going to understand what happened to those movies. But I disagree, and honestly, if they did it, if they retconned those films, some people would understand and get it while others simply would not. And if you're not vested enough to understand it, you're probably not going to care about it happening anyway, even if you're generally someone who likes and watches Star Wars. Because, and I know it's anecdotal, but no surprise here, a lot of people in my personal life know I do this on YouTube and talk to me about Star Wars or want my thoughts on this or that or have a question about something. And most of these people would fall, at best, into the casual fan category, with some being the type who don't think of themselves as fans at all, but do watch and enjoy some Star Wars things, mainly the movies and now The Mandalorian. And if any of these people are watching this video now, which I doubt because, again, they're not the biggest of fans, you have my apologies, because let me tell you, they sometimes ask me the dumbest questions you can imagine, or questions that I think have very obvious answers that anyone, fan or not, would know. Again, I've had people ask me, when does Rogue One take place? What Death Star is that? Or is it a new one? I thought there were supposed to be some Bothans or something in this movie. Same thing, and to an even worse degree, happens with The Mandalorian now. I've been asked a surprising number of times by people who have seen episodes of the show if this takes place before or after Return of the Jedi. Another question I got just the other day was, is that the real Boba Fett in the show? And I thought, well, maybe they think it's a clone of Boba Fett. After all, Jango was used as the template for the clone army, and, well, you watching this probably know all that. So I thought maybe this person was asking if it could be a clone pretending to be Boba Fett. Which is an interesting but almost certainly wrong theory. And when I said, no, I don't think it's a clone pretending to be Boba Fett, they just sort of looked at me confused, like I was the one who didn't know what they were talking about, and asked if it's the same Boba Fett from the movies, and I just said yes, it is. So what's my point here with all this? Well, it's that whether you keep or retcon the sequels, it isn't going to make much of a difference to a lot of people who do indeed watch Star Wars and call themselves fans. There is a section of the audience who enjoys Star Wars at face value and for what it is, and that's that. And if you tell them the sequels happened in a different timeline, they'll likely just go with it. the same way they go with or flow along with changes and different iterations in other similar franchises. I mean, a lot of people like the different versions of a character like Batman or Spider-Man that have come along now in the past couple decades. And even though they don't live and breathe the stuff, they can still understand that this Spider-Man is not the same as that one, or that this one's a part of the MCU and that one isn't. And it's funny how in some ways I think we give the general audience too much credit, and in other ways not enough. But anyway, here, there is this part of me that says, nah, they'd never do something like this with Star Wars. They'd never retcon or overwrite some of the existing movies. But then there's that other part that reminds me that Hollywood does this sort of thing all the time to similar franchises. But then I say Star Wars is something different. Star Wars is something special. But then I remember I might just be a little bit biased, and that to them in Hollywood or at Disney, it's likely no different than any other money-making property that they own. They'll use it in whatever way makes them the most profits. And if they truly think retconning the sequels or overwriting them is the best course of action and will lead to the most money, then that's the one they'll take. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about all this. When do you think Rogue Squadron will be set? And would it be too confusing to a lot of people if the sequels got retconned and replaced with a different story? Or would most just go along with it? Whatever you think, leave a comment below. And let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.